Thank you all for coming to this symposium, which is organized by myself and my colleague Fruzi, who is not here today. So the backstory behind this symposium is that a few years ago, my colleague Fruzi, who is from Hungary, just like Zoltan, contacted me saying that there is an old tradition in Hungary that when an academic reaches the age of 60, they prepare an anthology in their honor, but it's done secretly. So it's like a secret birthday present. I said, wow, that's interesting. Let's do one for Zoltan. How old is he? And she said, well, he was about to become 60, so we started, we had to do it secretly, of course. So we reached out to some people, and quickly the slots filled up. So we started this book project. Let me move this one. So we started this book project. We finished it, and we didn't know that this was the last thing we were going to do for Zoltan. And as one of the contributors, Robert Murphy, said, now you will not look at this cover image the same again. Okay. So I skipped a lot of things of what happened because the pandemic hit, and it hit everybody, including the chapter authors in this symposium. Ophelia Garcia, for example, she had COVID while she was writing her chapter. Many of the other authors also got COVID along with their families. One of the authors also had 2 family members dying while they were writing the chapter also. So everybody had, has gone through difficult times during this time. So the book, it has 4 sections. First, general reflections, and then language engagement, which is an upcoming important topic. Selves approaches, which is one of Zoltan's legacies. Emotions and affect, and then emerging topics. And as you can imagine, because it has an impressive lineup of authors, we reached out to them, and all of them agreed to join in this project to honor Zoltan. And this is why Paula Winke commented in the blurb that this is a modern-day dream team of language motivation. So this is going to be a standard symposium where we have 4 speakers and then 2 discussants and a panel discussion. And originally, Rebecca Oxford was going to be a discussant here, but she couldn't make it. And because this symposium was based on the book in his honor, and it was in the works for months, we contacted Zoltan asking him whether he would be able to come, but he couldn't because of health reasons. And then we thought, let's live stream it, and then we couldn't do that. At least we will record it and he could watch it, but now we couldn't do that either. So one more thing before we go to the presentations. We have an initiative that we officially launched in the Open Scholarship in Applied Linguistics Symposium hosted at the University of Cambridge. Our speech was scheduled the 10th of June. That was the very day that Zoltan passed away. So we dedicated this initiative to his memory. So if you pick up your phone and you go to this pledge, and you can sign up to make scholarship and journal articles specifically open access through sharing your post-print, which means the accepted version of your articles. So the preprint is the first draft that you submit to the journal before peer review. The post-print is after peer review, the accepted version. And according to the copyright policies of most publishers, you are allowed to share the accepted version. It doesn't fall under the copyright restrictions. A few of them have an embargo period, but most of them are okay with it. And so the point of this initiative is that more people sign up to share the accepted versions of their manuscripts, because many people can't have access to open scholarship because of paywalls everywhere. And you can only imagine the countless researchers who will be able to read your paper only through this accepted version that you will post online. So it will be a big help for many people, maybe for years, maybe generations. So even if you are already practicing this, we would encourage you to go and sign up, because this will show that you support this and encourage other people to sign up. We have, regarding future plans, we are now planning to integrate this with the IRIS database. Luke, is he somewhere? Hey, yeah. So that when you publish a paper, you upload your instruments as the accepted version in one package also. So if you sign up, we will let you know when something happens about this, when there is an update. Also, future plans is we plan to lobby publishers to change their restrictive copyright policies. In many cases, it's unfair for us. We are the ones who do the research. We are the ones who review the research. We are the ones who edit the research. And then we have paywalls everywhere. So, but we cannot do that unless we have a critical mass of people, supporters. So please go and sign up on this link. So I'm going to pass the mic now to Sarah, who has a few more announcements before she starts her talk.
Actually, I'll be very brief. I think most of you know that we've got a Condolences book for Zoltàn at the front desk at the registration. If you have some note, what we would like to do is collect this as a kind of scrapbook, celebrating his life, showing our appreciation, showing how much love and respect there is for him in his community. And then we're going to share that with his wife, Sarah, and his boys. So if you have time, please do take a moment if you can. We've put some post-it notes there in case people want to just go and sit quietly and think for a moment. You can write directly in the book if you want to. If you do write on a post-it note, please don't write on both sides, because we intend to stick them in permanently later. So we've just one side at the moment so that we can keep them in place, but we will put glue on the back and stick them in permanently, so please don't write on both sides of your post-it note if you're going to put a post-it note in. If you could do that before the end of the conference, because Denny has kindly offered to take it back to Nottingham and to pass on to his family, and I think it would be a very nice thing to do. Denny has also got another initiative. Would you like to come and perhaps tell us about that?
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, just very quickly as well from me is that Sarah and I were talking yesterday, and I sort of had an idea that I've now talked to some of you about, that, and you've been very supportive. If that is the case for more of you, then great. I was wondering about putting together... we were talking about the context of the symposium today, which is very much to celebrate and to say thank you to Zoltàn for his work, and to commemorate the impact on the field. What about us as a family of researchers? I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels that they've lost a friend or even a family member. So I was wondering about creating a kind of an informal video that perhaps shares some anecdotes, some kind of positive memories, happy memories that you have of Zoltàn, maybe your impressions of him if you did meet him, just in a few words. And if you didn't meet him, but you would really like to get involved and to share some of your impressions of him from communications that you've had with him. Many people have told me that they've never met him, but they had a very warm impression of him via email, or perhaps how his work personally touched you, as I'm sure is the case for most of us. So if this is something that you would like to get involved in, please come and see me if you would like me to do that for you. I'm kind of here as, if you like, your unofficial camera person, not as well as equipped as this colleague over here, but I'll just be using my phone, and I'll ask you some questions. It will take about 30 seconds to a minute. We can find a nice quiet space or have sort of nice kind of conference background. I'm very aware that many of us who have those memories that perhaps they would like to share are not here. They've joined online, or otherwise might not be available at this time. So I've myself and Katerina Mentzelopoulos, who recently who collaborated with Zoltàn very recently on a book, and is also a PhD student at Nottingham University, like myself, have set up a couple of ways in which you can get involved if you would much rather do this, but you don't feel comfortable doing this with me today or tomorrow during the conference, but you would like to do that another time. Please upload any videos to the Google Photos account that Katerina set up earlier. You can do that. You can reach it through the code, or through the through the link at the bottom. If you're not a Gmail user, do please use OneDrive. And if neither of those options work for you, please just email us at an email that Katerina set up this morning. And if you've got any issues, just email me or just grab me today. I have some instructions here if you want to take a photo of those as well, in terms of how to upload. You'll notice here that actually I've mentioned not just video files but photos as well. The book that some of you I know have contributed to, and that Sarah mentioned, it would be very nice to include some photos for Zoltán's family as well. So if you would like to upload those, then we can. I'll print them off when I get home, and I'll stick that in the book and deliver that to Zoltán's family. So yeah, if that sounds like a good idea to you, please come in and speak to me. I'd love to hear your stories and share mine as well. Thank you.
Okay. I have to admit, I've been dreading this from the bottom of my heart. But I'm going to try and focus on the content and the things that I've learned from Zoltàn and the things that he shared with me, and I'm trying to focus a little bit on the work so that I don't dissolve in front of you. This was, of course, originally planned way before. This was planned to talk about whether language learning engagement really is something new, or whether actually it's old wine just in a new bottle. Is it just a little bit of a, as we say in German, Etikettenschwindel? I do want to say, this is a lovely photo, Denny, that you can have of Zoltàn sat on my terrace at my house. This is a Zoltàn you need to know is very strongly tied to PLL. He did the opening plenary at the very, very, very first PLL conference. So where he sat in this photo is where we decided to start PLL, Stephen Ryan and I. And Stephen said, if you can get Zoltàn to do a plenary, you're sorted. And fair game to Zoltàn in his open-mindedness. I wrote to him and said, would you be willing to come to, you don't know who I am, I'm some random woman in Austria. Would you be willing to come? It's all about PLL. You are the god of PLL. Would you come? And he said, sure, okay. And he did. And as you can see where we all are now, the rest is history. So quite honestly, without him, I don't think there'd be any PLL conferences, and I certainly don't think there'd be an IAPL. So I think we're all indebted to him for that for a very long time. So now on to engagement. So engagement's been labelled the holy grail of learning and one of the hottest research topics in the field of educational psychology. And the date's 2015, so it's not that long ago. So it really has become the focus of attention for researchers in the field. And there has been a notable shift also in our field. So obviously Zoltàn and I, that's my connection with Zoltàn, my closer connection with Zoltàn at least, was we worked together on this book on engagement. And maybe I can just give a little aside, is when I went to see Zoltàn, we're just such a small community, I was actually an external examiner for Phil. And that's what I was doing in Nottingham. And Zoltàn said, should we do a book together? And when someone like Zoltàn asks you that, you go, yeah, okay. So yeah, I think that's a good idea. And he said, what should we do it on? And I'd had this idea and I thought, should I say this to him? So I thought, oh, well, you know, those of you who know me know that I'm not famed for keeping my mouth shut. So I said, I think motivation may have had its moment. I think we need to move on to engagement. Now, you're saying this to Zoltàn Dornyei, so, you know, that's a bit of a cheeky thing to say. But because he was the wonderful human being that he was, he said, tell me why. So I did, and then he said, let me sleep on it. So I said, okay. And he did, and of course his wonderful openness and curiosity and his endless love of trying out new things, learning, exploring, and off we went on that adventure together, and it was wonderful. So that's how we got into engagement together. Obviously, we've had a symposium in this conference this morning, in fact, on that. Phil, Ali, and I had the pleasure of editing a special collection on this recently together, a book of papers in the PLLT series. It's on the front desk if you want to go and have a mooch. And recently, there's also been a systematic review of 20 years of work in SLA on this. So there's stuff there, it's being done, and it's definitely on an upward trend at the moment, I think. But it's not completely new. I mean, there's been people working on engagement before, and as I'm going to show you, I think it has heritage, and I think Zoltàn has laid the foundations for this in 4 key ways. He made a switch to take motivation away from this notion of it as a personality trait and started looking at what's going on in the teaching learning context. I think that's the first major contribution. He looked at process and temporality and looked at how things were happening in the classroom, in action, this dynamism. That was a big move. Task-level motivation and conglomerates. So I'll explain a little bit more about those. So I picked out some of his key papers as a kind of storyline to show how I don't think this is something necessarily brand new, but something that Zoltàn put signposts along the way, and we just kind of gathered those together and picked them up. So in the 1994 paper, the On With the Challenge, a wonderful key paper for our field that brings it back to practice, that engages with that, he looked at the nature of learning situations, and this was a major sort of statement also in this paper about the fact that motivation's not a personality trait, but it's also shaped by context, that what's happening there is happening in the context. This contextual view was very much part of his desire, and one of the things that is so incredible about Zoltàn was his ability to think like nobody I know about empiricism, about theory, about research, and then to think about, okay, what does that mean for practice? What does that mean for teachers? What does that mean for classrooms? And there are not many scholars of his stature and brilliance that are able to straddle that boundary in those two communities. But this book was kind of key. When I was as a teacher, this book was a great guide for me, and I used it enormously. But this was also this shift to saying, what's going on in the classroom? What does this mean? What are we doing in the classroom? What's actually happening? And he has this sort of underlying belief that teachers make a difference. And that's hugely important to understand in motivational research, and that switch away from saying it's not just something that's a personality trait or a characteristic, but this is actually, you know, something that is malleable, something that's going on in the classroom. Just to kind of point out that there has been an ongoing problem about relating motivational research to practice, and a review that Zoltàn did with also 2 of his colleagues showed that this is still a huge outnumbering of practice-oriented papers, and I think that problem is ongoing. I think that possibly is a problem for our PLL generally, that may be an issue that we need to think about generally. But this wanting to engage with practice is at the heart, I think, of this surge of interest in engagement. If you ask teachers what problems they are facing, it's engagement. It's about getting learners to focus their attention, be on task, and engage in what they're doing. So 2 key reasons, perhaps, for the appeal of engagement that we felt was one of the drives behind this, and this fits to what Zoltàn has been stressing since the 1990s, is engagement is teacher-friendly. It resonates because it's immediate. It means you can engage with it immediately, you can do something with it. And it has this malleable quality. It's something that teachers can proactively develop. The next thing is then process and temporality. So many of you will know this paper. This was a key paper in 1998 that took a process model view. Now, this is way before we started talking about complex dynamic systems theory. And he was already there looking at dynamism, looking at process, looking at what's happening and how that's fitting together. And this paper cites specifically the shift between intention and action. And that is the fundamental discussion that we need to have about the relationship between motivation and engagement. Where is the boundary between intention to do something and the actual action that you're doing it? And that was way back in 1998. And that when we look at the definitions now, the key definition that is used by many scholars in engagement scholarship is motivation reflects an intention to act and engagement reflects the action itself. Zoltàn was there with his colleague way early. So I think for me, engagement is about action, it's about change, it's about dynamics on different timescales. It's always part of a process. So engagement fundamentally is dynamism, it's process-oriented, it's about what's going on, it's action, it's not static. And this is the model that Zoltàn and I developed and have been using in the book. It's meant to be cyclic. I created the model, which is why it's such a mess. But it's supposed to indicate that it's not linear. That's what it's supposed to convey, but of course doesn't very well. But you have a willingness to engage. You need some trigger that triggers your engagement. And then the challenge for teachers is to maintain that engagement. How do we keep them engaged and keep them on task? So the next thing, of course, a natural shift then, of course, was this move already. He'd already noted this shift from looking at dispositional traits to looking about situated designs, how student motivation is reflected in concrete classroom events and processes. And that meant a switch in levels of granularity, focusing on specific actions in the classroom, specific activities, and taking the timescale and level of granularity down to the task level. And in my view, a lot of the task-based research, a lot of the studies that have looked at engagement have looked at task level, and that is, where that tends to come from. The last thing I'm going to just mention is conglomerates and individual differences. This was a book chapter, but he's written about conglomerates in different places. It's all over the place, sort of starting around them. But this is the paper he cites himself as the place where it began. Conglomerates are these motivational, cognitive, and affective factors that come together to act as a whole. Now, that's got to resonate with anybody with a CDST background. That's got to resonate in terms of how they come together, how they function as wholes rather than separate things. And of course, engagement is defined. We had the conversation in the symposium this morning that Ali was talking about. Engagement is understood as being a functioning whole that comprises behavioral, cognitive, and affective components. So engagement could possibly be viewed as a conglomerate, as an example of a conglomerate. And maybe we need to think about what are those factors that contribute and generate engagement. The final thing that's related to conglomerates, for me, related at least, is Zoltán's work on DMCs, directed motivational currents. Henry and colleagues talk about motivation and engagement in a coherent motivational superstructure. I love how that's worded. I love the notion of that. I like the idea that you're looking at superstructures or clusters or how multiple components come together to function as a whole. And DMCs are, of course, about different timescales. So it's got engagement and it's got other things on different timescales. And I think that is an exciting path forward, and there's a lot of work to be done there. And it was, of course, very visionary to have that notion of taking that process, moving from that level of granularity of task-based in the classroom and stretching it, and that's what Zoltàn and his colleagues have done with DMCs. So is it a new lens? It's about person in context for me, engagement. It's about focusing on teaching contexts and tasks. It's about what teachers can do. It's malleable, it's very practical. It's about action, therefore change and process. It functions on different timescales, it's multifaceted. It can be a conglomerate itself, but it can also maybe combine with other factors to create superstructures that we don't yet maybe understand, but things like DMCs that we might want to explore more. So engagement is perhaps a new wine, but it's a cuvée. For those wine buffs in the room, a cuvée is a blend of grapes that already exists, but they're not served individually, but they're blended together to make a cuvée. I really am going to stretch this wine metaphor, I must warn you. So it is indeed a new wine, but it's a cuvée, so it has heritage. These are some, this looks like a fangirl photo, it is. This is my terrace and just some of my Zoltàn books that are on the table at home. And I use it as an excuse to pour a glass of red wine, a cuvée, to try. And looking back at Zoltán's work, he was truly, for many of us, a role model, not just academically, but also as a person. But he was visionary. He was always ahead of everybody else in terms of his thinking. And I think he has left us ingredients, inspiration, and signposts that we can pick up on and integrate into our new work as we move forward. We can learn from him, from his examples. So I'm hoping that we will be inspired by Zoltán's work to make wonderful new blends with engagement, thinking about cuvées, thinking about things that are going to be interesting to explore with engagement, attention, interest, curiosity, grit, agency, persistence, self-regulation, groups dynamics, translanguaging. The list can go on. I'll just end with this lovely photo from PLL3 with Zoltàn and his family, and Amy, you're up there front and close. Thank you, Zoltàn, for inspiring me and opening up so many pathways of thinking. I will miss you very much.
Okay, my turn to add my voice to those who loved and admired Zoltàn. I would want to, the whole principle about positive psychology is that you don't just highlight the positive, right? So Zoltàn and I, we met in the late 1990s when he was at Thames University. And he was a formidable scholar, and we kind of liked each other, and we decided that we might want to work together on some book. You know, I said, I'd love to write this book on emotion. Would you be interested? And he said he was, but then in the end, he wasn't. Once I showed him what I had in mind, that's not quite what he had in mind. And he said, no, you should change this, and I want you to do this instead of that. And I said, well, sorry, Zoltàn, but no, I want to do this. And so we kind of fell out. We were both a bit angry with each other, but it never got nasty or personal. It's just that we disagreed and that we decided that it was best not to continue that project. And I think it's good to be honest about these things, because sometimes it happens in academia that you want to work with someone and then it turns out that you don't actually have the same thing in mind. And it's better then to stop early rather than to try and then abandon the project halfway, which would be more painful. I say that we always had that little tension between us, and I always enjoyed teasing him. And the thing is that he was very good at being teased. He had a great sense of humor, and he could tease back and forth, and hence we had this ongoing running joke almost that I say, you know, you're not paying enough attention to emotion. Where is emotion in your ideal self? And you know, you talk about emotion, but except for anxiety, there are no positive emotion dimensions in your model. It's at best at item level. And the example is his 2005 Psychology of the Language Learner has just 15 occurrences of the word emotion. In his revised edition with Stephen Ryan in 2015, there is much more attention to emotion. So I kind of got him round. And then I think he also liked what I did with the online questionnaires, and he was very impressed with what Peter and I had done. And so he asked me to join him to co-author the third edition of his questionnaires in SLA book, which is in production right now. And the last email that I got from him on the 3rd of May was that he approved of my choice of cover for the book. And that was our last communication. And I had been so much looking forward to presenting him this talk, which would be another teaser, because I just enjoyed annoying him, really. I don't know why. And I knew that he could take it. So this is how I introduced him at PLL 3. I compared him to the Pope, referring to his strong religious beliefs. And then I said that he had this combative streak, and that Pope was in fact the wrong image, and that Batman was more accurate, and that as Batman he had lots of Robins, and I guess that we are his Robins, and I'm the last Robin in line when the book comes out in November. Now, one of the interesting debates that we had with Zoltan, and Peter was included in that debate, is on the relationship between emotion and motivation. So a psychologist like Reeve says that they are completely unconnected. Peter and colleagues said, no, there is a strong connection between emotion and motivation. And Zoltan was a kind of an in-between. He had this halfway position where he said, well, some emotions possess a certain amount of goal-directed quality, but no goal-specific action, just action tendencies. So he didn't deny that emotions played a positive role in motivation, but he wasn't quite prepared to give them a kind of an independent status. So they were there to amplify existing motivation. And we had this email exchange where he said, emotions cannot be equated fully with motives, because motive energizes, gives direction, and if you're emotional, it's not directed. And again, with Henry in a recent paper, he describes emotions as just additional fuel, but no more. Now, this would have really annoyed him, which was that in this empirical paper, I used Gardner's well-established attitude motivation test battery. The reason is that I wasn't particularly interested in the L2 self. I was interested in people's attitudes towards the target language community and towards the language learning situation, things that disappeared in the later versions of his L2 self theory. So I don't need to explain to you what Gardner meant with attitudes and motivation. We used the mini AMTB with these different dimensions. And then we also were interested in the foreign language classroom anxiety, and the definition by Elaine Horwitz. This is one of her later definitions in a book I co-edited, and I couldn't help but, of course, including a picture of our first PLL where we were, you see Tammy in front. You also see the second from the left in the background is Elaine Horwitz, who was also a very dear friend of us, and we missed her, so that's why I wanted to include her picture too. So again, you will have heard maybe a couple of papers mentioning the definition of foreign language enjoyment, a concept that Peter and I came up and that Eloise Botes and Pia Resnick have been developing and doing great stuff with it. We explained that it has an intellectual dimension, that it's more than superficial pleasure, and that it's really linked to the amount of challenge, the right balance between challenge and skill. Eloise Botes, again, on the pre-conference, explained to you how we developed this short scale with 3 sub-dimensions: personal enjoyment, teacher appreciation, and social enjoyment. And a number of studies have shown positive relationship between enjoyment and motivation, negative relation with classroom anxiety. And then Zoltàn also always called for more longitudinal research. And we know it's so hard because you have attrition, you lose. It's hard to carry out longitudinal research, but we all agree that it's really very useful to determine causality. And so, again, Zoltàn and Henry called for more research on long-term motivation, sustained motivated learning, and we have seen at this conference also the DMC, which has this longitudinal aspect to it. So there have been a number of longitudinal studies in the past couple of years, and I think we still need more. Also important, and it was one of the things I tried to convince Zoltàn about, but he wasn't convinced because we didn't have the data at the time. It's that emotions matter independently of motivation, that they are in fact separate predictors of progress and success in the second language. And so a paper that came out just a couple of days ago in Mirek's journal, we showed a strong positive correlation between enjoyment and willingness to communicate, between enjoyment and academic achievement. And in a previous paper, we also showed a strong negative correlation between achievement and foreign language classroom anxiety. So the research questions for this study was about stability of these emotions and attitude motivation, and how it was for the different dimensions, and the relationships between these variables. So we collected data from Kuwaiti foreign language learners. Half of them were studying English, the other half were studying other languages. They had Arabic as a first language. As you see, they were quite multilingual, mostly of Kuwaiti nationality. And so we collected data 4 times over 1 semester. And these were the results. And we were kind of surprised ourselves, and that's the pleasure of doing research. You expect variation, and then you find it in unexpected places. So as you see there, enjoyment and anxiety remained absolutely stable over the course of the semester. And when we looked into the sub-dimensions of enjoyment, we discovered that, in fact, teacher appreciation went down significantly over the course of the semester, whereas personal and social enjoyment remained unchanged. And this very morning, we saw something similar, a study on attitudes motivation, where motivation levels went down over the course of a year. And this is also what we found. There was a significant drop in attitudes motivation values over the course of 1 semester. And when we looked more specifically, we discovered that there was no change in integrativeness or instrumental motivation. That didn't change. But attitude towards the learning situation and motivation, these dropped. And so what we concluded was that this seems to support Peter's position that positive emotions can be powerful motivators in themselves, that sometimes learner emotions may morph into rather diffuse action tendencies at the start of a course, but they can become more goal-specific as the course progresses, and that anxiety may not be goal-specific, but I would argue that enjoyment becomes increasingly goal-specific over time, and crucially, that enjoyment can survive the drop in motivation caused by disenchantment by teacher and class. And it's something we discussed with our Polish colleagues this morning, that maybe students start a class with unrealistic expectations, that they think it's going to be fun all the time and it's going to be easy, and then they discover that it requires hard work and that maybe the test results aren't what they had hoped to get. And so those may be explanations why motivation drops. So I would argue that the difference between enjoyment and motivation is that enjoyment becomes something that is state/trait-like, that can that is in fact much more stable than motivation. That motivation is very much linked to the context of the class. But if you really enjoy learning the foreign language, then that enjoyment will help you through the school holiday, and you will start afresh and hopefully again with a replenished level of motivation until the motivation tank drains by the end of the course, but still your enjoyment will remain relatively higher. So our conclusion was that FLE personal and social become the buoys that keep learners' motivation afloat. So at this point, I'm sure that Zoltàn would have that kind of fixed grin on his face, because he wouldn't want to show that he disagrees too publicly, and then he would say, yeah, Jean-Marc, I don't quite agree with that conclusion, but then we'd have a glass of beer, and then I'm pretty sure that we'd make up. So thank you.
Okay, it's good to see everyone. Thanks for hanging in. So now it's my turn to talk a little bit about Zoltán's influences on me and my work. I think I met him a bit later than others who have spoken initially. It was at a AAAL conference. I had recently finished my PhD. I had worked with motivation, but not the L2 motivational self system, because it was just starting to gain popularity in 2009. But I had started to read about it, and I knew he was at AAAL, which is the American Association of Applied Linguistics, and I saw him at a coffee break. And I think the right word is I cornered him and did not allow him to exit the room until I had the chance to go up and talk to him and ask some questions and talk a little bit about what I am going to elaborate on today, which is the anti-ought-to self, and I'll tell a little bit about how that concept came to be in my research, specifically in Anglophone contexts. And he started talking about, well, this sounds, very interesting. And in fact, we're organizing a conference on motivational dynamics, and it sounds very dynamic. And, why, don't you consider coming to this conference? And I thought, oh, absolutely, I will. I went home from AAAL in spring of 2013 and bought my plane ticket for fall of 2013, which in fact was the wrong year. So it's the only time I have purchased a plane ticket for a conference, not just the wrong date, but a year ahead of time. I was so excited to go to the conference. And so that is how our relationship began. In any case, so you all are very much aware of what the L2 motivational self system is, with the two selves, the ideal and the ought-to self, and the learning experience. But what I was starting to think about early on with a colleague of mine, Camila Vasquez, when I was still at the University of South Florida, we were working on some narrative data that we had collected in the Anglophone context about advanced learners of languages other than English taught in Anglophone context. We were enjoying a glass of wine, and Boo Boo Kitty was, circling around our ankles in her backyard in St. Petersburg. And there was this piece of the narrative data that we couldn't quite make sense of. It didn't really fit into any of the motivational frameworks that we had encountered. And I said, it's kind of like the ought-to self, because it's coming from external influences, but it's like the opposite. It's like the anti-ought-to self. And so at that moment, we started talking about how, in fact, in some contexts, there is this strong sense of self when you want to do something or learn a language because people tell you can't, it's impossible, it's too hard, why in the hell would you do it? You're an English speaker, right? All these types of things, which turned out to be really relevant in our data and others' data that are also talking in Anglophone contexts. And so here's a little bit of the theoretical framework that goes with the anti-ought-to self. Very short excerpts that come from a couple of our participants in this initial set of interview data, which we collected many years ago. Alex is an L1 English speaker who is a Chinese instructor now at a Research One university. His first encounter with Chinese is that his teaching assistant said, "God, you're really bad at Chinese. You shouldn't do this. Pick another language." And he said, "This motivated me to keep going." And so I did. And now he's known for his Chinese acumen. In fact, he appears on Chinese radio talk shows in China and is quite well known. So he really took that to heart. We also had Joe, who was a bilingual Spanish-English speaker who grew up in the Bronx, and he wanted to learn German. And so throughout his narrative, he talked about, I'm a Gonzalez in a group of Germans, and so on and so forth. So kind of saying I wanted to learn this and study German, even though everyone told me I shouldn't, and everyone else was a speaker of German. This comes from the concept of psychological reactance, or the perceived threat of freedom, which is primarily a Western construct. So it's that, it's said to be like a Western construct, although data we collected in China has also shown that this is the case in other contexts as well. The example of this is a child getting a tattoo because parents said no, or as I said, my sister got her belly button pierced because my mom said absolutely not, and she said, well, of course, that makes me want to do it. And so this kind of is the innate idea of the anti-Atu self. It's been shown to arise in Anglophone contexts pretty regularly. Ursula Landvers also has thought of this idea as the rebellious self, and she and I have collaborated on some work and have talked about how the Anglophone context, in fact, has this arise pretty frequently. There's also been work in Canada and also in Australia that have used the anti-Atu self context. Okay, so since we're talking about imagery, so you can have an idea about where we're going to go with this talk a little bit. This is my front yard in Reedsville, West Virginia. So if you ever come to West Virginia, which I realize is unlikely, but just in case, you're all welcome to come to our farm in Reedsville. I'm going to talk a little bit about data that I collected from in West Virginia, but not from the typical participant pool, which are university faculty, instructors, and students, but instead data collected from the community about perceptions of learning languages other than English in this context. To give you an idea about a little bit more about the idea of West Virginia, it's a state with primarily rural cities, if you can even, I think you can call them cities mostly, but the largest one is about 50,000 people. Go on down to the 10th largest has about 15,000 people. So you can see it's the communities, the population, it's not very populous, and the population that does exist is rather spread out. And it has a lot to do with the topography, the hills, the valleys, the difficulties in traveling, the road, the infrastructure, and these types of things. Where I live, where you saw the picture just a second ago, it is a town of about 600 people, and it takes me about 45 minutes to get to West Virginia University, which is where I work, which is the 4th largest city without students. When the students come in, which are about 35,000 of them, it becomes the largest city in West Virginia. So you can see what a difference the university makes. All right, I think I talked about this. One thing I will mention, West Virginia has historically had a reputation of the population being relatively uneducated. This is, in fact, a falsehood, whereas the high school education, high school diplomas are on par with the rest of the nation as of now. Historically, it has been the case that fewer people finished high school. Now, in case, it's almost the same. West Virginia is predominantly composed of L1 English speakers. There are very few inhabitants that speak a language other than English at home. In fact, my L1 speaking Turkish husband, when we got the last census back, we could see him represented in the census because he was the only one in our town who spoke a language other than English. So that was interesting. In contrast to a state like Florida, which we moved from Florida to go to West Virginia, which has about 30% of speakers of languages other than English at home. Okay, so here's the state. You can see it's there. Within the US, it's actually only 3.5 hours from DC, so if you're visiting the capital, you might as well just stop by and see us. And you can see within the state, West Virginia University is very close to Pennsylvania. Where I live in Preston County is the big green county right to the right of that one over there. Okay. We have some more images here. Here is the university and the downtown area, and also some representatives from my extraordinary department, which is the World Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics. These photos are pre-pandemic when we could do things like gather in groups and take pictures, which I'm hoping we can get some updated ones next year, because I've been using these for about 3 years now in the presentations that I give. All right, so we have talked about throughout the conference how a lot of the participant pool indeed are affiliated with the university, right? So we have students because they're readily available, we have faculty, we have, in some instances, staff. And so the idea of this project was to gather information from those outside of the university context, those who are part of the community, to have some other ideas about attitudes and motivation to learning languages. It was a shout out to the West Virginia Humanities Council, which gave me funding to be able to do this project. So my first task, of course, was to create a questionnaire and pilot it. So I had never collected data from people who weren't used to being participants, right? Who weren't used to, like the idea that these types of research projects existed. Luckily, I have very kind neighbors who went through a series of pilot tests with me with this material development, and I said, my goal is to have everything on one sheet of paper, and I want you to be able to finish it in 5 minutes. Because when you're out, like at farmers markets, I also went to Tractor Supply and set up a table and harass people who were coming to buy chickens or fertilizer and asked them to fill out this questionnaire about learning languages. It had to be quick, right? So you can't hold people's attention too long. I also did collect some data via social media because my intentions to collect data face-to-face were thwarted somewhat by the pandemic. I was able to do a little bit, but I have about half the data online and about half from social media. The full questionnaire is published in this publication a few months ago, and it is an open access publication. It also, interestingly, the abstract is translated into French, and with the editors, we had a long, detailed discussion on how do you call the anti-autu self in French, right? Any guesses, Jean-Marc? It's hard, right, it's hard. So we came up with le moi résolu, which I think was like my determined and, yeah, I thought so. That was my idea, right? They had something else. I rejected that, but in any case. So that was also an interesting activity. We had some background questions at the very top, some very basic ones, age, level of education, what county did you grow up, where did you go to high school, these types of things, which I will take a look at with the data. And then we had 23 questionnaire items, 21 items on a Likert scale with existing frameworks, and then here they are. You're welcome to, the questionnaire is publicly available, and if you can't find it in the journal article, you're welcome to email me and I can send it. 2 of the questions were suggested to me by my neighbors and other folks in the pilot study, which I added. Okay. So about I convinced about 100 people, unsuspecting people at farmers markets and Tractor Supply and online. If you all don't know what Tractor Supply is, I tried to find the Canadian equivalent yesterday. I said, Peter, you can go there and you can buy chickens and fertilizer and supplies and plants. And he said, Amy, I don't know. I don't know that something exists. In any case, I convinced these unsuspecting people to spend about 5 minutes of their time collecting data. I will say that a few of them, I did give the option of me reading the questions out loud because I didn't want the literacy level to affect people's willingness to stop and participate in the study. And so there were a handful of participants who were not able to read the questionnaire, so I read the questions out loud and marked down their answers myself. And as expected, it was primarily L1 English speakers. Okay, and there were people who had mostly lived in West Virginia, others who had lived in a different state, and very few that had lived outside of the country. Some had visited other countries, but almost all of them were to Mexico or Canada, which also was to be expected. A handful of them also had regularly watched movies or listened to music in languages other than English. And something that I was very happy about, this question, which my neighbors also suggested that I add to the initial part of the survey, is how do you feel when someone speaks around you in a language other than English? Only 2 people said annoyed, right? So it was a forced choice answer. They could choose either interested, annoyed, nothing at all. And only most people said they felt interested. Almost no one said they felt annoyed. There were representations of all sorts of different professions within the group, which I thought was very interesting. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to show a couple of very descriptive data. So I'm still in the process of collecting data, so there are no formal analyses yet. And here we have, this is the questions about people's concepts of, like, do people around me feel that language learning is important? The first 3 bars talk about the milieu specifically. The last 2 bars give information about the perceived importance of teaching a language other than English in high school and at the university, which, even if you can see that the first 3 bars show that the average people had kind of a neutral idea about if those around them thought languages other than English were important, but almost everyone thought that they were important subjects to be taught in school, which I thought was also an interesting finding. I had items on the anti-autu self, but also constructs related to the anti-autu self, including grit, buoyancy, and these types of things. As I suspected, most of the participants that filled out the study had very high levels of, if someone tells me I can't do something, in fact, I'm going to try it, or if I run into a challenge, I'm going to try to overcome it, so on and so forth. These were 2 of the pilot questions here, and what was also fascinating to see was that even if people didn't speak a language other than English, they wished their kids would, they wished their grandkids would, they wished it upon the kids of their friends and family and these types of things. Okay, what I will go to are the final thoughts right here. So despite stereotypes about West Virginia, people are quite open to languages other than English, and so then the questions follow, right? So how can we translate these positive attitudes to actual language study? What are some obstacles to language study in rural locations such as West Virginia? There's been very little written about these types of contexts, so we're looking into this a bit more. And specifically, what can universities like West Virginia University do in rural locations to support teachers at the K-12 level? Because without that support, we are not going to get the language learners that continue into the university setting. So as I was finishing up this last night and thinking about how I was going to close, this news article popped up on my Facebook news feed. And so apparently today is the celebration of the 50 years of women's athletics at West Virginia University based on a Title IX law that passed. And I was thinking to myself as I was going through and reading through the article that described the 3 women who started the women's tennis, basketball, and gymnastics teams 50 years ago, and how much resistance they faced and how much opposition they faced in trying to get these activities up and going. And I thought to myself, what would happen if, in fact, when someone told us something was impossible or we shouldn't do it, what if we just quit? What if we didn't forge ahead and follow our beliefs and try our best, to get these things going? And so leaving with a word of encouragement, oftentimes the biggest difference that you will make in your life is doing something that those other people tell you you can't. So thank you, Zoltàn, for supporting these thoughts for me. Rest in peace.
Right, Zoltàn was famously a stickler for time limits, so I'm just going to go straight in, because we are a little bit behind schedule, I know. And my starting point is also his 1994 On With the Challenge article, in which he said, I believe we can foresee in future L2 motivation research a dynamic interplay of established motivational constructs grounded in a social psychological approach, which of course had emerged here in Canada, and constructs rooted in other psychological fields and approaches. And he did this throughout his career, bringing ideas from other areas of psychology, right up to one of his most recent books, The Innovations and Challenges in Language Learning Motivation, which I thoroughly recommend. And so it's in that spirit that I am going to today, in my 15 minutes, just talk about a construct that actually doesn't appear in the index of this book. And I think he would approve of me doing this kind of very speculative talk. It's not based on my own research at all. It's actually based on a book that I didn't even read it. I listened to it while walking my dog, but it really inspired me. And it's about expectations or expectancies, which one could define as the anticipation of outcomes from one's experiences or behavior. And it's by David Robson, who is actually a science journalist, and what he's doing in the book is, the strapline is "The brain has a mind of its own," which is nice. He is a science journalist, and he's looking at serious research in many different areas, such as neuroscience, sports psychology, education, and other emotions research and other fields. And he's bringing them together. It came out earlier this year. It's still in hardback, actually. But I hope you'll be inspired to read it after I've talked a little bit about it. In the introduction, it gives a very telling, it describes a very telling piece of research by some researchers from Harvard. They a controlled experiment. They found that hotel cleaners, like the ones who are hopefully cleaning our rooms today, get measurably fitter when they think of their work as exercise. So when they were told, it was a controlled experiment, and they told some hotel cleaners that what they did was actually like a workout, while others they didn't tell that. And then they compared their fitness after a month, and they found that those who had been told that their work is actually a workout had lower their blood pressure had come down, they'd lost weight, greater muscle power. Which, led me, this is in the introduction, it led me to sort of start thinking, well, would students learn more English if they believed that they could benefit, for example, from watching Hollywood movies? Would they learn more if they truly believed in the pedagogic powers of their teacher? This was my speculation. I'll come back to education a bit later. But the book is grounded in neuroscience, really. The fact that the brain is a prediction machine. We are constantly thinking ahead on different time scales, from the sort of nanosecond to the day to the lifetime. Constantly predicting outcomes, and as we anticipate, our limbs move, our muscles prepare, our emotions form. It's a constant process of thinking ahead. And, our senses are also primed by expectation. Back to the wine metaphor, it's well-known experiments show that if we are told that a bottle of cheap plonk actually costs, £50, then we will taste things in the wine that are actually not there. Colour a bottle of white wine red, and people will, even experts, will, find aromas of blackberry and plum. It's actually white wine. So our senses are primed by expectations, and even those of experts. Most well-known expectation effects, of course, are the placebo. Placebo effects, where you, if you expect a drug to do you benefit, it's more likely to. It's interesting that placebo effects are actually increasing as people become more aware of them. So that their placebo effects are in educated, literate societies are much greater than in non-literate, because people just know about placebo now, and this is causing problems for drugs companies because they can't prove that their drugs are working any better than the placebo. Nocebo, also equally powerful. If a drug has on the label possible side effects include drowsiness, and you read that, you are more likely to experience drowsiness. In fact, you know, the experiments in Australia showed that the way it's framed as well makes a difference. So if it's framed negatively, possible side effects include drowsiness. Approximately 27 out of 100 will experience drowsiness, compared to the more positive framing of 73 out of 100 will not experience drowsiness. You know, the negative framing has greater consequences. More people will experience drowsiness. And these expectation effects are contagious, socially contagious. And you know, many examples of this, but I'll choose one that's familiar to us all. Vaccination reactions. I had this view that I don't think I'm a hypochondriac, but I did think that when you had a jab, it was putting a little bit of the virus into you, and therefore you probably would get a little bit of flu or of COVID. And so on my second vaccination, I thought I had a little bit of COVID for 2 or 3 days. I'm guessing that some other people here, quite a large number, probably felt something. You know, you felt sort of flu-like symptoms. But of course, actually, you know, modern vaccinations are not, they contain a microscopic amount of the virus. And some don't even contain that. You know, it's a protein of, so actually the reaction is a nocebo. So a lot of the research on expectations effects in the area of sports science. And we're becoming aware that, you know, athletes like Kipchoge, the runner, will say things like, you know, I always say I don't run by my legs, but I run by my heart and my mind. And the psychobiological models of exhaustion, you know, put the brain at the forefront of explaining why we feel exhausted. It's not just about the lack of oxygen in our muscles or glycogen, or it's not just physical. It's about the brain telling us that we're exhausted, and it tells us we're exhausted because of its expectations. You know, that if we normally run for about 30 minutes, go jogging for 30 minutes, then around 30 minutes, 25 minutes, you'll start to feel exhausted. Change the expectations and you will change your capacity. I mean, this has been shown with very high-class athletes, because the brain is very conservative. It's always wanting to conserve energy for emergencies. So if you can sort of convince yourself that actually you're not in an emergency situation and you can use your energy reserves, then you can do more. And, you know, many experiments have shown that increasing the expectancies can boost performance. Many of us will have taken supplements while engaged in a long cycle ride, and these work even when they don't have anything in them. In fact, apparently they work even when the person is told that they don't have anything in them. Because what matters is the belief that you can actually override your exhaustion, you know, that you have the power to do it. Visualization exercise is another example of this, of trying to, when you envision yourself being successful, what you're doing is kind of priming yourself, priming your brain, priming your body to achieve what you hope to achieve. You know, and visualization, of course, Zoltan was very fond of these, and was actually, you know, this lay behind his L2 motivational self system, the ideal self. So just turning to mental performance, mind over mind. 3 very well-known people. What do they have in common? Just look at the pictures. All dressed down every single day of the year. They would wear the same thing, pretty sure of that. And apparently they do it because they don't want to waste any mental energy on choosing what shirt to put on in the morning, President Obama said the same thing. He always wore the same shirt and suit. I mean, he had lots of suits, but not the same one every day. But he didn't want to waste any mental energy. So, what they had in common was that they shared a lay belief in the concept of ego depletion. That willpower is a limited resource. Recent experiments suggest this is not actually true and that it's mediated by expectations. As Robson himself says, the consequences of ego depletion are real. We do lose willpower, but only if you believe in it. When you go through this, you think my mental stamina is limited. That's the mindset. So after that exhausting task, I better preserve my energy, and therefore I can't resist that ice cream. Very recent, a very, very interesting research by Carol Dweck, actually, and colleagues, with primary school children, where they read a story that shows where they're convinced that, willpower, exercising willpower doesn't exhaust you, it actually energizes you. Then they're presented with, they found that these children could actually exercise willpower and resist the marshmallow. So, okay, just turning then for the last few minutes to education. Probably the most very well-known expectation effect in education is the Pygmalion effect, whereby teachers' expectations of their learners' capacities influences their behavior and really can have long-term effects on those pupils' achievements. This is quite now well established. There was a special issue of Educational Research and Evaluation in 2018 celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Rosenthal experiments. And learners, therefore, are internalizing their teachers' positive and negative expectations into their own self-concept. And, one way this is done is through the type and quality of the feedback that teachers give to learners, and which Lou and Noel's research has brought to light in our field recently. I suspect this is also true in teacher training, that if you're involved in pre-service training, your expectations of those students of yours, are transmitted and will have effects, which of course links to, much of what Tammy was saying yesterday about signature strengths, emphasizing those signature strengths, showing that you have positive expectations of those students. A recent article by Reeve and Chion suggests that teacher expectations about changing themselves, this is in-service teachers, easiness of change is the best predictor actually of them changing. So if they believe in their capacity to change, they will. Okay, and finally coming around to L2 motivation research, I think, the expectancy value model of motivation had a lot of traction in the 1980s and 90s, kind of disappeared a little bit, never really had much impact in our field yet, although that is making a bit of a comeback. However, expectancies are clearly a thread that runs through many areas of our field: vision, self-efficacy, mindsets, attributions, but not quite expectations as Robson conceives them, I think. So vision, for example, we think of the future, our ideal selves, can be a very powerful motivator, but as some commentators have pointed out, we don't usually in our measures include the probability of our ideal self being realized. Maybe we should. And of course, Zoltàn always emphasized that an ideal self has to be realistic. I don't have time to go through any more of these. I would just say I added emotions actually at lunchtime because attending Eloise's talk. There's a whole chapter on emotions in the book, and the main message was that actually it's not the emotions themselves, it's how you perceive the emotions that matters. So anxiety, it's how you think of your anxiety that will tend to affect whether it has positive or negative, whether it's facilitative or debilitating. I would just offer the suggestion that perhaps we should focus more directly on expectancies and expectancies of a success in particular, to understand learner motivation and also language learning. Different timescales, task, project, course, lifetime. I know that Zoltàn has a new book coming out on great lifetime achievers in language learning. I'd be very interested to know whether those really successful language learners had high expectations. I think there's a lot of scope for interesting interventions, and I've run out of time. All I would say is on with the challenge.
So, Tammy and Peter, if you could start, and then we will take Q&As from the audience.
Hello? Hi. I wrote a chapter in the book that Ali put together, and that the chapter of the book was a direct result of one of the first things I ever read that Zoltàn had published. And it was in his his teaching and researching motivation book in the 90s. It was the first edition. And in that book he had just a paragraph, and it was about the role of the teacher in motivation. And it was the first time that I had ever seen teachers being cited as a part of the motivational process. Now, of course, other people had been looking at it outside of the area of language learning, but this was the first time I had seen it within what I did. And the chapter that I wrote, along with a colleague from Saudi Arabia, was fascinating in the sense that because Sarah and I had been writing in the Teacher Well-being book that a teacher who's in a good headspace will have learners in a better headspace, that the teacher will affect the learner and the learner will affect the teacher, and so that would be reciprocal. But I wanted to know that. And so we did a very simple study where we had 7 groups of students, 7 classrooms of students with 7 different instructors. They would come in, take their emotional pulse, which was on a scale from 1 to 10, how motivated are you to be here? The teacher would do the same. They'd put that away, and then at the end of the class, they'd do the same thing. And what we wanted to do was to see whether or not the tendency was going up or the tendency was going down. And it was amazing that almost invariably, if the teacher, their tendency was going up, so did the students. If the tendency was going down, so did the students. And it was just it was a very simple study, and it was only with tendencies. But I remember, when this book was supposed to be a birthday present, I thought that was just really cool, because Zoltàn had got me. He was the one who got me started thinking about that, just by that one paragraph in that first book. And so now that this is a tribute, I would like to just say that love you, Z, and maybe we'll have some of these towards the... We started out as colleagues in applied linguistics, but how we were when the last time I saw him was that he's extremely devout in his theology, and I grew up extremely devout My father was a Baptist missionary to Africa. And in my 20s, I rejected all of that. And he always laughed because he said, I grew up with agnostic or with atheist parents and came to know Jesus. You knew Jesus, and then you came to reject him. I said, well, that's the way it goes, buddy. So anyway, that's Zoltan and I love him. So, Petey.
All right, thank you. So I'll just take a moment to share one story. I tweeted out one of my favorite stories a couple of days ago on Facebook. So if you've seen that one, I was going to tell that story, but I won't repeat it. I do want to tell you about a AAAL in Costa Mesa. And my presentation was on the self, which is the topic of the chapter I wrote for your book, Ellie. And Zoltan and I had a similar relationship to the one that Jean-Marc described. We would tease each other. I think there was mutual respect that you would not meet a warmer, more caring host than Zoltan, his wife Sarah, and the boys. So, absolutely that heartfelt personal connection. But academically, we had a couple of points of disagreement. And I come from the Gardner School. And as you know, Zoltan did not fully agree with that perspective. So at AAAL in Costa Mesa, Zoltan had just published his self theory. And being a Gardnerite, I had to say something. So what I did was I put together a PowerPoint that had self-concepts on it. And I said, okay, if we're going in this direction in the field, we're going to look at the self. Let's look at what we're getting into. So I put up 10 concepts, one by one. Look at all that. We have to deal with all that. And now we have to, oh, wait a minute, and then a whole new slide came up with 10 more. So, well, that's 20 concepts. This is getting complicated. Then I pressed the button again. 50 concepts in total, all with the word self in them. And I said, well, we're in for a bit of a ride now, aren't we? And so the audience laughed, everybody laughed, and I thought Zoltan would be so mad at me because he had just moved his theory, and this was his treatise, right? This was where he wanted to go. He planted his flag on the self. And here I was kind of teasing him that this is so complicated, I don't know how we're going to deal with it. And as I sat down, Zoltan came to me and said, that was brilliant. So he could take it academically, he could take it personally, he could take the teasing. Just a wonderful intellect, a very great man, and yeah, as everybody has said, we're going to miss him.
Thank you, Peter and Tammy. So now we are running out of time, but it's time for questions. So if you could please make questions brief and directed to the content of the presentations today. I think, is there a mic going around? Anyway, if you have any questions, you can just shout it out.
What was Zoltan's favorite beer? The answer is, as long as it was Hungarian.
Well, I guess somebody needs to ask questions. I think it's a question or maybe request to Sarah. If you could elaborate or perhaps push the relationship between perceptions versus engagement, or behaviors, sorry, perceptions versus behavior, and that's similar to motivation to engagement that you talked about, and the relationship between research and practice that you kind of implied. Please.
I missed the first part. What am I supposed to do?
Well,
I'm sorry.
because I think what you wanted to say.
I got all the constructs, but I didn't get what I was meant to do.
Right. I thought what you wanted to say was.
Which I clearly did well.
Yes, you did. To understand how language learning happens, we need to look at the behaviors as well. Is that what you implied?
Yeah, I think my understanding of how we have moved towards engagement, and obviously I used Zoltan's work as kind of signposts along the way, is that engagement is obviously about process. It's obviously about what's going on in the classroom. It is it is malleable, and it is about change over time, and it is about practice. So I think if we're interested in understanding dynamics, if we want to look at engagement, we need to look at action, we need to look at behavior, we need to look at what's happening in the classrooms and beyond. We talked about that in the symposium, but looking specifically, that means we need to look at what's happening in the classroom. We need to look at practice. We need to look at teaching. And I think very strongly, and I think Zoltàn would agree with me on this, we need teachers involved in that conversation. And I would make a strong plea that, particularly for engagement research, teachers are in a fabulous position to join, to either be the teacher researcher or to join in partnership with others to do that kind of participatory research. I think that's engagement is the perfect place for that to happen.
How would you involve teachers?
Oh, man. I think we need a whole other symposium for that, quite honestly. But somebody asked me this actually yesterday or the day before, so apologies for those people. I've been repeating myself. I think it has to come from the teachers. So the problem is when researchers go and say, we want to research it, teachers themselves, and that's a whole, I mean, literally this is an extremely complicated issue to do with time, resources, access, willingness, you know, there's a lot involved about why, but I think if teachers want to engage with researchers, and if we can open up that dialogue space, and if we can share our expertise, then I think that could be a very fruitful partnership for both sides. But both sides have to want it, and that's a bigger issue and bigger debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? The mic's there. Yeah.
Okay, better? Yeah. Since we just have a few minutes, can we just maybe go down the line and hear sort of one last thought of how you would bring Zoltán's research into the future and kind of a last maybe takeaway?
Can we start on that end?
Jean-Marc, it's to you.
I think that what I would see in the future, I mean, I would say that Zoltàn has planted many seeds and that they all grow in different directions and that people transfer the seeds to their own unique environments, add their own fertilizers, try and see whether it grows with little sun and lots of water. And I think also just the spirit of Zoltàn is not to keep everything moving. I mean, it wasn't a surprise that he got so interested in dynamic systems. I think that the learners' foreign language development is a dynamic system. I think that research in itself is a dynamic system. And I think that at this very conference, we see how concepts that were only just coming to the surface at PLL1, that they have grown, and then that they have grown in different directions that we could not possibly expect. So, and I think that Zoltàn would be really pleased to see that, people use his models and do something that he would completely disagree with instinctively, and then after a beer with the author, that he would turn around and say, well, let's write a book about this.
Yeah, so I think one of the ways to pay tribute to him is to build on his work critically. No, don't be overwhelmed by, I can't disagree with some of his ideas, this idea or that idea. He built on Gardner's work critically. Some people disagreed, some people agreed. Also, you can build on his work critically. Also, some people will agree, some people won't agree. So you need this courage to build on existing ideas critically.
I would say one thing that people have started to think about a bit more is the concept of the learning experience and what that means in terms of motivation and part of the model, and thinking about it also in terms of contextual factors. So the different data collection tools, different types of interpretations of data and how people interact are going to vary widely within contexts, between contexts, and even folks within the same context are not going to react in the same ways to similar stimuli. So what Sarah said, context is not monolithic, right? So you can't assume that everyone from one area is going to act in the same way, but how does that then fit in to this idea of the learning experience specifically? So Ali, I think you've talked about it as motivated learning behavior as well as other people, and I choose to think about it as contextual factors. And so I think that piece of the model, which was Zoltan referred to as the Cinderella of the L2 motivational self-system, because it's the least developed part. And so I think that's an area for ripe development.
And I think that L2 experience is where engagement is also rooted in that actual experience in the classroom. I'm going to tell you one little more story. Is I don't know how many of you were at PLL1? Oh, look, we got some real old-timers. Zoltàn, as you know, was a strongly quantitatively oriented scholar. He did his opening plenary on narratives. Now that just tells you everything you need to know about him as an adventurous, courageous, curious scholar who was always trying out new things and coming to stuff and not being afraid to try something new, where, you know, quite honestly, at his stage of the career, he could have just coasted into retirement. He didn't need to start trying out new stuff, but he did because he had that curiosity. So if I take anything, it's I want to understand curiosity. I want to understand the curiosity of teachers, how they keep going with professional development of learners, how that contributes to their engagement. And I can't think of a better intellectual, of a person who displays that kind of intellectual curiosity and love of learning than Zoltàn, who methodologically spoke to my heart.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'll just mention a quality, a signature strength, perhaps that maybe we wouldn't normally associate with Zoltàn, but humility. He never actually thought he had the answers. He was always looking for more and looking outward. And just a very quick anecdote. The first time I met him was actually at a symposium on motivation in general education in the Lake District in the UK. This was 2003, I would say. I was a genuinely humble PhD student, and I was lecturer as well, but I was a PhD student at Leeds, and he was, you know, already the god, you know, for me. Yeah, I was following reading everything he wrote and so on. I managed to have a conversation with him there, and partway through that conversation, he suddenly said, you know, turned and said, sorry, Martin, and dashed off. And I watched him go down the corridor, holding his book, 2001 book, Chasing Carol Dweck. And he caught up with her, and I could watched from afar as he humbly handed over his book to the great Carol Dweck. So, you know, I realized at that point that, you know, although there are giants like Zoltàn, you know, there's other giants. The giants are standing. We're all standing on each other's shoulders. Yeah, and he knew that.
All right. So maybe just to finish off the thought that I started with, the idea that the self is a part of the motivational system. The paper that I wrote for Ali asked, you know, has it been worth the trouble? You know, after all these potential concepts, is it worth digging into the self as a motivational concept? And I came to the answer of yes, under certain conditions. And I think Zoltàn would agree with this last comment. Just don't be sloppy about it. Have a good reason to put it in there. Make it a core part of your being, like Amy talked about, where you're a determined person who will not take being told what to do, and you'll go and become a great Chinese speaker because that is who you are. If that's your concept, self works. And if it's not, then don't just attach the word self to another concept. I think Zoltàn would agree with that statement, and I'll let Tammy finish it off.
Nothing is static. Nothing stands alone. Those are the two things that I'm going to always take from him. Everything is in constant motion, and everything is constantly interacting. And if we think about that for me as I'm training teachers, or for me as I'm, loving learners. It guides how I have to think about what my role is. So I think that if all of us just remember, nothing is ever static, and nothing is ever alone. I think that that's a pretty good principle to stand on. Personally, the one word that I heard from Big Z's mouth more than anything else, that's actually a phrase. I think I've heard it 100 times. And you would think that he was taking me to task. But every time he said it, he was laughing. And he would always say to me, "Oh, you are so naughty." And the funny thing is that he always encouraged my naughtiness. Because the last time when we were in Nottingham at the conference, he took me aside and he said, "Would you introduce Peter MacIntyre?" And I said, "Oh, I have too many stories." And he said, "I know." And I said, and he told me, "I want you to dig up the craziest, worst stories that you can think of. And I want you to introduce Peter." I said, "I got your back. I got your back, Z. I got your back." So I just, I'm going to miss him. I loved him in life. I'm going to keep reading his stuff in his passing, and I'm just going to keep celebrating his life and his intellect, and hope to do justice to what he left for me to stand on his shoulders. So just a great guy, and I miss him. So, yeah.
So thank you, Megan, for this smart question. It kept us all going. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And just a reminder, Dörnyei is here. If you are interested in taking part in this collage project, you can approach her. Thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of the conference.